Hello everyone, this is Colin, and today I have another story for you. Sort of. It's a story about moving forward. When I originally started thinking about starting a channel, the idea of having any sort of vocal component didn't even enter into the equation. At first, I just wanted it to be speed paint type videos with just music. That evolved into maybe some sort of voiceless tutorials, but I had trouble finding what I could even teach that wasn't already covered 1,000 times better by so many others. But eventually, I stumbled over a concept that I could definitely execute. But it meant using my voice. I know that it's something of a cliche, just telling some story about something ridiculous from your life, but telling stories over a speed paint, or speed draw in my case I guess, just spoke to me. Even though I may sound like a nervous 6th grader trying to give a speech sometimes, I love telling stories. Fiction or real life, it's something that brings me a great deal of joy. But a lot of the stories I have to tell are somewhat personal and frequently emotionally intense. Diving into that on top of speaking to complete strangers on the internet has been a daunting task. For more reasons than just the stories themselves. Reasons that will become obvious soon. This one isn't exactly structured enough to be called a proper story. It's certainly not a structured narrative, but it's still something important I need to discuss. And not just the courage to discuss this, but to do literally any of this was inspired by the subject of today's drawing. Thomas Sanders is something that's incredibly rare to find. He's genuine and wholesome, while being very honest and just very real. He remains positive without lapsing into being aggressively saccharine or worse. For a long time, I just followed him on Tumblr mostly, so I was only really familiar with things like his 2 a.m. reblog spam and his short videos. I only recently started digging into his longer format videos here on YouTube. And here I found a goldmine I wasn't expecting. A rich vein of content that was both incredibly emotional and exactly what I needed to hear. Some of it was incredibly pertinent to the moment, or it was something that reinforced lessons I'd already learned on my own the hard way. Not only that, but suddenly something I'd been using as a sort of coping mechanism didn't seem so strange. What I had been doing wasn't quite so literal as the Sanders Sides videos, but I took all of these little pieces of myself and made them into characters to sort of look at them from the outside. And eventually I built stories with them and they took on lives of their own. But this story isn't just about my characters as a coping mechanism. It's about what the mechanism is helping me cope with. To be quite frank, the last few years have not been easy for me. It wouldn't be hyperbolic to say it was one of the most difficult phases of my life. Most of it is a long, convoluted tale which I could fill a dozen videos with. And I plan to, eventually. But I will give you a rough sketch for now for a little context. I had been living with my mother so I could afford to go to school, but she was super emotionally abusive and extremely transphobic. And that was really the start of this really bad time in my life. Because after putting up with everything she was doing, she left me high and dry, almost literally. She just moved out one day. I had to drop out of school, find a full-time job, and an apartment in a really short amount of time. All of that just wrecked me so hard it took about 6 months to even get back on my feet in a creative sense. I just didn't really draw anything for a while. Then I got sucker punched twice by serious rejection once I barely got back on my feet. I was about as stable on my creative legs as a newborn deer. Well, maybe sucker punch is a bit too harsh for what happened, but that's how it felt at the time. The first one was more like getting shoved into a puddle of mud and just kind of sitting there for a while. Actually, the second one was too. As I mentioned in my last video, I was once a comic colorist. Through all of this mess, I was looking to return to that, so I started digging back into that community. I started putting together a portfolio, and I even had a few professionals giving me advice on what I was doing. I thought I actually had a chance. And as fate would have it, this coincided with a local convention where I could show off my meager portfolio to anyone who was willing. Then it got better. I heard from a reliable source that an editor from Vertigo Comics would be there. When I got to the booth at the time he was going to be there, there wasn't even a line. I honestly thought I was in the wrong place. It was just a guy in a suit at an empty table. So I walked up to him, shaking like a leaf, and showed him my portfolio. I was absolutely terrified because he kept asking questions I didn't have the answers to. Just things I hadn't thought about. It was like, oh God, I'm not ready to be a professional. And it was also my first time speaking to a real editor of any kind. I mean, not counting my last video, but that wasn't really a real editor. Because he was someone from a company that people actually knew. Then he told me I wasn't ready for big name publishers. It wasn't an easy thing to hear because I generally thought after all the work I'd put in and all of the feedback I had, I might actually have a chance at something. But he made me feel like I was still a newbie and had no idea what I was doing. But thankfully, he didn't just write me off outright. Not only did he tell me some other publishers that might prefer my style, but he gave me a ton of advice. Because of everything he'd been telling me, I took a risk. I pulled out my phone, and with shaking hands, I started trying to show him personal work I'd done rather than the stuff that was meant to be for a portfolio. It was like some illustration work that I had done. He got to one of the pieces that I'm still proud of to this day, and then he stopped. He said if I could pull off this sort of dynamic color in a comic, my portfolio would be way more impressive and I could jump into especially sci-fi comics. Not exactly what I'm interested in, but it was something to focus on. The problem was, it was basically the opposite of what I had done for my portfolio. On top of that, he told me that I'd chosen pages that weren't very good art-wise, and that was extremely detrimental to the portfolio as a whole. And I'd found these from professionals around the internet or from various sources, and I thought they were pretty decent, and they compared to what's usually published, but they weren't good enough. After this, I was a weird mess of devastated and hopeful. And so much so that I didn't even offer a card or ask for his. I couldn't even remember his name when I walked away from the table. It had been a lot to process. Very soon after, I found out who he was. My information had been slightly inaccurate. He wasn't an editor for Vertigo. He was an editor for their parent company, freaking DC Comics. Somehow, though, that just managed to amplify everything I had been feeling. It was amazing that I'd actually met with someone from one of the big two comic publishers. And I hadn't been dismissed outright, but he'd basically told me I'd been going on the wrong path this whole time and I needed to go back to square one. Trying to keep myself together, I found a quiet corner of the convention center and pulled out my sketchbook. I just started scribbling out one of my own characters, fittingly, my own anxiety character, and while I was there, I had an epiphany. The piece the editor had liked so much had been a color scheme test for the comic I'd been developing for some far distant future project. If I had to go back to the beginning and start over again, why not take a drastically different path this time? Either one would take some serious time before it was lucrative, but one of them would be a lot more rewarding personally. The next day, I dragged out a test project I'd started more than a year before. I had been part of a comic battle website that could sometimes give really decent feedback. I'd started a comic involving my characters that was written out, but I'd only loosely sketched a few pages. So I kept the script, but scrapped the art and started again. I was going to use those 10 pages to figure out the style I wanted for the larger comic. It was bold and new, very experimental for me, and leagues beyond anything I'd posted on that site before. It was vibrant and dynamic, and some of the best backgrounds I've ever drawn. I once again let my hopes get the best of me. I foolishly expected people to either be impressed by my work or at least give genuine feedback. Either way, I expected a ton of comments. My friends were getting heaps and heaps of comments on their comics, even if it was just random chatter, so I could at least get that much, right? And when I finally posted it, I got next to nothing. I expected a strong response, positive or negative, because this site is no stranger to the way the internet typically goes. People were happy to tear apart things when they didn't like them, and there were a lot of people who did not like bold, colorful styles. So I expected those people to come out of the woodwork to tell me I'd done everything wrong. That would at least be a response, but instead, what I got was tepid at best. A few close friends left me some really good, honest feedback. But they'd also seen the comic through the entire process and had already been giving me feedback. Beyond that, the comics were mostly just two people arguing over trivial details in the writing and nothing about the art. I was frankly wrecked. If my absolute best work ever couldn't get a response out of a community who knew me and was much, much smaller than the broad world of webcomics, how could I expect to ever get a response at all? I felt like nothing I did would ever be good enough. Like I was just fading away. When I started being able to talk about how I felt about this situation, I described it in loose personifications. I'd said that depression and anxiety were a pair of bullies who made me their favorite target. Then it was as if logic stepped up to break up the fight simply by explaining the facts. Mind you, this was before I really knew anything about the Sander Sides videos. This simple explanation worked much better now than it had in the past because my logic had gained a lot of strength and confidence lately, while depression and anxiety had lost some of their power over me. In the past, my logic had been this meek little thing trying to talk basically monsters down from a fight. And now, the playing field was a bit more level. In reality, it was more that I was in a serious funk and I didn't see it. I knew I was frustrated by the comments, but I only figured it out in the aftermath. So much had happened over the last year, I felt like the brief high of making the comic had been the anomaly. Then one night, I was standing in my dark kitchen eating rice pudding straight out of the Tupperware, and a sudden thought kicked me in the back of the head. You're depressed because no one liked your comic the way you thought they would. It was like a sudden light came on and I could see where I'd ended up. It took a while to dig myself out completely, but I got back to work on my comic and that really helped. And it was then that I started to see just what my character represented about myself. My methods were a little different. Where Thomas tends to represent those aspects more as how they make him feel, mine were more how the emotion or aspects treated me. Dane, my anxiety and insecurities, is an obnoxious pest who doesn't know how to leave well enough alone. Crawford represents my passion, whether creatively or emotionally. He's stubborn and difficult to motivate, but once he gets going, not even a brick wall will stop him. Dimitri is my logic, and, well, there's not much difference there. He even spends most of his time sneering at Dane, except he's kind of one of the bad guys. Jackie, however, only vaguely correlates. She is the closest the group has to a parental type, and she is rather supportive of my anxiety character. But rather than morality, she's more my confidence. It's fitting that she's the newest character by a fair bit. I've had her down in my notes for ages, but just in name. No personality, no design. Then in the last year, she started to take actual form. But this video is about far more than comparing my characters to things other people have done for my own entertainment, but I do that with everything I get into anyway. After those two terrible blows to my ego and confidence, I just withdrew completely. I kept cutting myself off more and more from my communities that I'd been involved in, and I dug into working on my comic. I went to work and hid in my tiny apartment, and isolating myself like that only made things worse. I already had serious anxiety that had grown a lot worse after everything that had happened. So when I was alone, it just kept growing. I found it difficult to even reconnect to people on things like Twitter or my friends who had been super supportive beforehand. It was as if Dane was sitting right there with me, listing off all of the ways people would hate me, while simultaneously demanding constant and immediate validation for every small effort made. It was a terrible cycle because the lack of validation only feeds into that voice that keeps saying everyone hates you. Making these videos has been part of breaking that cycle because I've been able to take control of my anxiety and refuse to let it rule me any longer. Because frankly, making these videos has me scared out of my wits. Like standing at the edge of a cliff, scared. While I've kicked around the idea of making videos of some stripe for a long time, I resisted the concept. Not only was it scary and putting me in the limelight, but what could I even contribute? I was a no-name artist on the internet. Everyone was already covering things I would want to do and doing it much better. So why bother? I found the exact answer to that question in one of Thomas's videos. Not just not letting anxiety be in charge, but not stressing over being completely original because everyone has their own voice, and that makes anything they make unique. Tons of artists do this exact format, but none of them are me. They draw different things than me, and they especially don't have my stories to tell. I'm already seeing proof of that in my comic, and the videos I've already done. While I haven't received much in the way of blatant feedback, every day just a few more people see what I've created, even if it's just one or two. That alone is enough encouragement to keep going. But even if I'm going to keep doing even one of these projects, someday in the far distant future, I will need to do things at conventions, especially for the comic. That means talking to people, face to face. My anxiety is bad enough when I'm hidden behind a computer, but anywhere any aspect of my physical self gets involved, my anxiety breaks out its strongest weapons, dysphoria and dysmorphia. The last time I tried going to a convention was the one and only time I've had a full-blown panic attack. It wasn't good. And even just sitting here at my computer, some days those things get so bad, I can't even stand the sound of my own voice. But if sheer force and exposure cured my absolute fear of the dentist, could that sort of immersion help me deal with some of these other issues? After just a few videos, I don't completely dread the sound of my own voice. In fact, I'm not even rushing through editing quite so fast anymore. It's only a little bit, but progress is being made. So maybe, just maybe, I can weaken the power that my anxiety wields if I take small steps. I know that so soon out of the gate, I won't create amazing things. You have to try and fail and be terrible before you can make progress. Or, in other words, sucking at something is the first step to being sort of good at something. And maybe, someday, somewhere further down this very long road, I can inspire just one person even half as much as Thomas has inspired me. I might be a salty grandpa most of the time, but I'm also a giant sentimental sap. So you can expect more videos like this in the future. As for the artwork itself, I was inspired by something I saw on Tumblr some time ago, and I couldn't even find it again. It was just a memory of something I saw, especially with that bold outline. And then I thought I had it finished, and I stepped back, because I did it all in one go, which usually you don't want to do that as an artist. And I stepped back and looked at it and realized there was some glaring things I did not like. It just wasn't what I wanted. Usually I'll either just go, you know what, send it out. I don't care. Or like, you know what, that's not good enough. I'm just going to scrap it. Instead, I made myself go back and fix the things that I knew were wrong. And I'm much happier with it. And with the finished result, it may not be perfect, but I'm proud of it. It's a sign of how far I've come and what I'm able to do with illustrations now as opposed to before. It's a bit more abstract, it's a bit different, you know. It's a matter of just moving forward. So I hope you like the finished results as much as I do. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, and I hope you have a wonderful day.